knitting just takes 2 needles. There's got to be something in this house that would work as knitting needles. Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Laramie and today I want to tell you about how I learned how to knit. Now this is my first YouTube video and this is primarily going to be a knitting channel. So I thought what better way to start a new knitting channel than to tell you how I learned how to knit. Before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am as a person, and because this directly influenced how I went about learning this new craft. So I am what I like to call a hobby collector. And what I mean by this is I think that doing hobbies up until knitting was my hobby. Like learning a new hobby, researching a new hobby, trying a new hobby for a month, storing all the stuff for said hobby, and then finding a different hobby and doing the same thing over and over and over again. I did this with quilting, woodwork, furniture restoration, painting. I was into watercolor for a hot minute. I also did this. I thought I was going to make a me-made wardrobe. I thought I was going to sew my own clothes. I never did. I think I made 1, maybe 2 items that are technically wearable, but I don't wear them, so are they really wearable? But by the time I got to this desire to learn how to knit, I had already spent a ton of money on all of these other hobbies that I never ended up sticking with. So in January or February of 2024, so just this past January and February, I got the inkling to learn how to knit. But I figured it was just one of those things where I would enjoy researching the hobby and watching videos about the hobby and gathering all of the equipment for the hobby and not actually pursue it long term. And another thing to know about me is when I am interested in a hobby, even though I have a very limited budget, will try to buy good quality, and that often means expensive products that support that hobby. So for instance, when I went down the roller skating rabbit hole during the pandemic, I didn't buy just whatever roller skates I could get my hands on. I bought Moxie roller skates, which are pretty expensive in comparison to some other brands, because I felt like if I had the best quality and, the more expensive ones, that I would actually pursue the hobby. And that actually never translated. I just ended up getting really nice things for the hobby, but then still not doing the hobby. I do still roller skate on occasion, so I don't have any regrets about the money that I spent on those things. But going into knitting, I knew that I didn't want to do that again. I didn't want to buy a bunch of really expensive, high quality but expensive materials and then never actually pursue the hobby or continue the hobby beyond just the initial. So what I decided to do, and I can't remember if this was January or February, it was probably more into February, I decided that I was going to learn how to knit, but I was going to do it as cheaply as possible. So what I did was I ended up going to Goodwill and I looked for yarn because I had seen yarn there before. And I was able to pick up this particular yarn. So this is Loops and Thread. It is Impeccable Acrylic in the colorway, let me see, in the colorway Hot Sunshine Speckle. I actually refer to this as my buttered popcorn yarn because I think it looks like buttered popcorn. It's just my assumption. It is just a nice acrylic yarn. It is very soft. I don't not like it. I didn't necessarily enjoy knitting with it, but I was also a beginner knitter, and I don't think that acrylic is maybe the easiest to learn with, but it probably has more to do with the needles that I chose than the yarn itself. So I was able to get 2 skeins of this yarn at Goodwill that day, and then I started looking for needles. I wanted to buy secondhand or used because, again, I'm trying to do this as cheaply as possible because I'm pretty sure at this point that I'm going to research it, maybe knit for a few weeks, and then never touch it again. And so I didn't want to collect a bunch of stuff. So I was able to get 2 skeins of that, but nobody at Goodwill was able to find me needles. I knew that you could find needles secondhand. I knew you could find a lot of needles secondhand, but nobody at Goodwill either knew what I was talking about or knew if they had them, or if they did have them, they had no idea where they would have stored them. And so I wasn't able to get needles while I was at Goodwill. So instead of doing the logical thing, which is going to Joann's, which was absolutely still open at this time, going to Joann's, picking up needles that matched this particular yarn weight, and I decided that no, I'm gonna go home. So I went home and I sat on my couch and I just kept thinking, okay, knitting just takes 2 needles. There's got to be something in this house that would work as knitting needles that I don't have to buy. And I came up with chopsticks. So I have them right here. I started knitting with a set of chopsticks. So here they are. Here's just my lovely little chopsticks. I keep wooden chopsticks in my house to stick into the soil of my plants to check if they are ready to be watered. And so I had a lot of wooden chopsticks lying around. So I just opened a new set and decided to start knitting. Now at the time, I did not have sharp tips. So most chopsticks have a flat tip on the end, so they're not like very stabby. So I decided that I was just gonna knit with that. And it wasn't until a little bit later in the knitting process that I realized that I probably need sharp tips on my needles, and that would help prevent yarn splitting. So I started knitting, and I knitted a pretty good chunk of this scarf using my Goodwill thread and a set of wooden chopsticks. Now, those of you who know things about knitting know that acrylic yarn can be very sticky as you use it, and that wood can make that worse, that it can grip to wood a little bit harder, or bamboo, whatever material this is, than it would if you were using, say, a metal needle. Now, that gets magnified when you're using a chopstick that is not meant to be used for knitting. And so it is very sticky. So was not a super comfortable knitting process. However, I am very grateful for it because I was able to learn how to purl and how to knit using my little chopsticks. And I have a decent fabric going on. So this was the very start. There are quite a few errors, and some of this I attribute to not knowing how to knit, but some of it I also attribute to using materials that are not meant for the job. So if you look down the bottom here, I don't know if you can see, I've got some holes and I've got some areas where I've had to adjust. So there's a hole, and I don't know if you can see, I have used a piece of thread and tied those together so that it didn't unravel. And then I had to do the same thing right here. And there's a couple more throughout this bottom, really the bottom half of knitting this scarf, where I had to do some adjusting. But overall, I was able to knit a fairly decent, that I threw on the ground, a fairly decent half of a scarf using yarn that I got from Goodwill for just like, I think the whole bag of yarn that this came with was $3.99, and then chopsticks that I had gotten for free at a Chinese restaurant. So pretty cheap start to my knitting journey. Once I got to this point in my scarf knitting process, I realized that I might actually really like this hobby, and I should probably invest in some better quality materials. So at this point, I did go to Joann's. I didn't know anything about local yarn shops at the time. All I knew is that Joann's was a craft store, and then I had one near me. So, and there's nothing wrong with Joann's, but I would prefer to shop local now. But I went to Joann's and I picked up some yarn to make a quilt. I believe it is super bulky. And by quilt, I mean blanket, just a large lap blanket was kind of what I was thinking, like a throw that I can just cuddle up with on the couch. It didn't need to fit on my queen size bed. It just needed to like cover my body. And so I picked up, I believe, 9 skeins of a super bulky weight yarn that is, I think it's Bernat blanket fleece or Bernat fleece. I digress. We'll talk about that on a future video. And I picked that up, and I picked up circular knitting needles so that I wouldn't have to hold all that blanket weight in my hands. And that is how I started knitting. I started knitting on some chopsticks and a skein of yarn from Goodwill that I still have here and never finished. And that led to me buying some blanket yarn at Joann's and starting to knit a blanket. That blanket is not done yet, though I do have full intentions of finishing it. It just probably not the best beginner project because it wasn't very satisfying in terms of, like, there was no instant gratification of finishing a project super quickly. Blankets take a while to finish, especially if you're doing regular garter stitch and you aren't switching colors or doing anything exciting like that. It can be kind of a slog. So then I started knitting a couple of washcloths and other things like that, a hat, and then I moved on to knitting my first sweater. And we'll talk about all of that in an upcoming video. But I am pretty proud of myself for how I started knitting. I think part of the reason that this hobby has stuck with me over the entire year, we're almost at the year mark, in a month or two, depending on when I actually started, we'll be at a year, because I didn't invest in all of these expensive products, and I didn't make it about the research and the shopping portion of crafting and a new hobby. I made it about the actual hobby. And I think it was also just a really good fit for my personality, being able to knit while reading or while watching a movie or talking with my friends or listening to a lecture. But I love knitting, and I'm so thankful that I have found this craft. And I'm making this YouTube channel because for one, I don't have a lot of people in my life that love knitting. I have a lot of people that love that I knit and that are willing to talk to me about knitting, but I don't have any platform or person to talk to about everything that I've knitting and keeping them updated. And so I wanted to make this channel to do that for you and make a kind of a digital diary for myself of the knitting that I have completed over the years. Now looking at this, I kind of want to finish it. It's got this like cool pattern repeat thing going on here. It almost looks like snakeskin. So I might finish this sweater, or excuse me, this scarf, but I will absolutely not be using the chopsticks. I will be getting regular knitting needles. So yeah, that is how I started knitting. And that gives you a little bit idea of how some of these videos may go. I imagine they're going to improve the more that I record them. But thank you for spending this time with me. If you made it to the end, I appreciate you, and welcome to my channel, and thank you. If you like this video and are interested in my knitting journey and the things that I've knit over the past year, please feel free to like and subscribe. I would love to have you here. I have no idea what my posting schedule is going to be. This is an extension of my knitting hobby, so it is just a hobby at this point. But I hope that you choose to join me, and regardless of that, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.